Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of the Team Deacons podcast, a collection of informal conversations between Roger and James Deacons and a guest. We never know where the conversation will take us, so listen in and see where it goes. This episode is sponsored by Camtech, a high-end motion picture rental company serving the industry since 1988. Camtech prides themselves on their passion for optics and the ability to engage and collaborate with cinematographers and their crews to achieve and provide perfectly customized systems, from custom-tuned optics to all the latest cameras and accessories. With industry veterans in every department, Camtech is uniquely positioned to meet your needs. Today, we're speaking with the director of documentaries as well as narrative film. A few of his films are Cartel Land, City of Ghosts, The First Wave, and A Private War. We're pleased to welcome Matt Heineman with us today. Thank you, Matt, for doing this.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
We'd like to start with asking you, how did you get to where you are today? Is it something that you always knew that you wanted to do, or is it something you found later, or did you stumble on it, or what?
I absolutely stumbled on it. I had...
Really?
I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I studied history in college, knew very little about film, didn't take any film classes. And then my senior year in college, I thought I wanted to be a teacher. And I applied for this program called Teach for America. And I got rejected. And so three of my best friends and I were sort of sitting around trying to figure out what to do with our lives, and ended up coming up with this idea to travel around the U.S. for 3 months to interview kids from all walks of life to try to understand what our generation's about. And that was my first film. We raised some money, bought an RV, bought my first, digital camera, and basically taught myself as I went. And that was my film school. And through that process, that cross-country journey, I fell in love with filmmaking.
Wow. But you decided to make that film and go on that journey. That's interesting. So where did that thought come from?
I think it was, a curiosity of sort of, where our country was and what our generation stood for, and just trying to sort of delve into that. It really was sort of just a curiosity. It wasn't necessarily like, I want to be a filmmaker. It was more just, we wanted to travel. We wanted to travel with purpose and try to do something. Yeah. And so we had, an early blog. It was 2005, which seems like a lifetime ago. Yeah, and we sort of set out on this little RV. And
wow. So how did you approach it? How did you approach subjects, and what did you shoot?
I think about half the subjects were set up beforehand. People like Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook. We filmed him sort of moving into his first office, which is, I think probably valuable footage that we should get out in the world again at some point. But,
yeah, really.
And then a lot of the people we just stumbled upon, drug dealers, cancer researchers, people we met along the way. And then about half of them were probably set up as well.
So you never went to film school?
Never went to film school, never took a film class.
You have such an amazing sense of composition and everything that we see of yours. So that's just all natural? You didn't study art? That's great.
I couldn't draw for the life of me. I never studied art. I think, I've always just followed my instincts. And I'll never forget, there's a moment on this cross-country journey when I was in New Orleans 3 months after Hurricane Katrina. And I followed a man named Frank into the 9th Ward. They just opened the 9th Ward to citizens to see their houses for the first time after the hurricane. And I'll never forget, just through this camera, through the lens, being able to capture this extremely intimate moment of this man seeing the devastation of his home and where he grew up, and what a privilege it was to be able to tell his story and to listen to him and to connect with him through a camera. And I remember having sort of the hair on my arms standing up and just realizing this is something I want to do for the rest of my life. Yeah. And I always sort of look back on that moment as sort of where I decided I wanted to be a filmmaker.
That's great.
Yeah, I know that. But you just convinced me that I wasted my my early years going to film school and all the rest.
I think you've done okay. I think you've done all right.
Yeah. It just shows there's so many different paths to get where you want to go. That's really interesting. What happened to that film? It's not one I've seen of yours.
That's okay.
No, we'd like to see it.
Well, I love watching your work. I mean, we'll get to Cartel Land in a minute, but it's one of the most beautifully shot films, let alone one of the most beautifully shot documentaries, which is usually harder, that you can see, So what happened to the journey across America?
It ended up becoming a film called Our Time. It was a 60-minute sort of long short. Yeah, not many people saw it. It's definitely not, the film I'm most proud of by any stretch, but, it started my career and I learned so much in doing it. And, I always love seeing people's first films because there's sort of an innocence to it. And there's not a lot that you can look at in Our Time that you can see in my work now. But there were some, instinctual things in the way I shot and in the way I sort of approach subjects and developing trust with subjects, which is sort of the bedrock of what I do, especially in the documentary form. So I think that's where I really felt like, wow, I think I have a decent ability to connect with people, which is obviously a huge part in making documentaries.
How did you come across the whole concept for Cartel Land?
So I'll try to give the short version, but I basically got that film in front of HBO. I applied to be an assistant. I heard there was an assistant position at HBO Documentary Films. I showed them Our Time, like an early cut of it. And instead of hiring me to be an assistant, I was able to get a job as a producer on a series there called The Alzheimer's Project. And I learned so much working there and being there. And then I made a film about healthcare called Escape Fire. And then, after Escape Fire, I think that's when I first read this Rolling Stone article about these border vigilantes on the U.S. side of the border that started me on the path of Cartel Land.
Just go back to Escape Fire. Was that something they asked you to do, or was that something you took on from your own self? Because it's such a huge subject, it's like healthcare in America.
I think no, that was the first sort of film that I went out on my own and originated. I made it with a mentor of mine, a friend of mine, Susan Fromke, who was a longtime collaborator of the Maisels.
Ah, right. Yeah.
And so I learned so much from her about shooting verite, about the art of cinema verite. And so that was an incredible experience making that film with her, with Susan. And again, I learned so much in doing that. But I think that also sort of was the first in a series of a bunch of films that I made trying to tackle big subjects that were, ripped across the headlines, but I don't think people really truly understood. And so in that film and in pretty much every film I've made since then, try to take these big amorphous subjects and humanize them.
Right. Like you're telling us about the man down in New Orleans after the Hurricane Katrina, it's the personal stories that I find in your work that are so telling. You take on these huge subjects, you think, my God, and with Cartel Land, it's the border and vigilantism and drugs and all the rest. But the way you tell it is very sort of personal. So shall we talk more about Cartel Land? Because for me, it's, and I think for a lot of people, it was quite sort of a moment in documentary filmmaking. I'd like to ask you, you work with somebody that worked with other documentary filmmakers. Who were your inspirations, or was Fred Wiseman an inspiration, or Penny Baker, Leacock? I mean, when I was at college, I was obviously a long time before you were. We were always studying these filmmakers, waiting to see their next, the next work they did.
Yes, Susan Fromke, who I made that film with, worked for many, many, many years with the Maisel brothers. So I learned a lot from that lineage of direct cinema or cinema verite. I was very fortunate around sort of Cartelian time to befriend D.A. Pennebaker and Chris Hedges, and just learned so much from him. He was a dear, dear friend and obviously a pioneer in this style of filmmaking. And so, yeah, I feel like I had a lot of mentors that I developed in my sort of early and mid 20s that really encouraged me on this path of making films this way. Obviously, there's so many different ways of making docs, and it's such a beautiful, malleable form. But for me, the most powerful way is through observational filmmaking, through verite. You know, I was 21 years old. I say this all the time, but it still holds true. I heard Al Maisel speak, and he said, if you end up with the story you started with, then you weren't listening along the way.
That's great. That's really great.
Which is good advice for life, and it's good advice for filmmaking. You know, don't be dogmatic, be open to the story changing. And that's something that I've held incredibly close to my heart at every step along the way, both in the sort of macro decisions of what films to make and, you know, but also just in a micro sense of every single day, every single second, every single frame of, you know, as I'm shooting, you know, be open to the story changing. Like what's outside of the lens, what's happening over there. You know, because I think so many, you know, doc filmmakers have like call sheets, and this is going to happen this time. Like I just don't believe in making docs that way. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's many beautiful, successful films doing that. But for me, it just every film I made, it ended up completely differently than what I started out making. And Cartel-Land is a, you know, vivid example of that.
Yeah. While we were just talking about other filmmakers, I've just a quote from Fred Wiseman, who actually said, the editing is highly manipulative. The shooting's highly manipulative. What you choose to shoot, the way you shoot it, the way you edit it, and the way you structure it represents subjective choices. Wouldn't you say that's true? I mean, however objective you're trying to be, it's still you there making a selection. You say you want to be aware of what's around you, but you're still choosing that one point of view.
Oh, it's unbelievably subjective. I mean, every single aspect of what we do, of deciding when to press the record button, when to turn it off, what lens to choose, what focal length to be on, when, you know, in the edit room, obviously when to cut, when not to cut, what sounds to put into the film score or otherwise. And, you know, for me, the devil is always in the details. I mean, there's never, you know, a frame or a sound or even a pixel that I haven't like argued about or contemplated in my films, probably to a fault of my life and maybe my producers who are trying to control the budget. But, you know, I really am extraordinarily meticulous in every aspect, and that is absolutely subjective.
Yeah. All right. So tell us a bit more about Cartel-Land, how that came about and how that evolved for you shooting wise.
So I read this Rolling Stone article about a group of U.S. vigilantes on the U.S. side of the border, quote unquote, fighting the Mexican drug cartels. And I thought I was making that film. So I ended up following two different U.S. vigilante groups and filmed for it actually took about 6 months to gain their trust. They're quite reticent, quite scared of, you know, a liberal New York filmmaker coming down to the border and telling this story. And after gaining their trust, I ended up filming for about 3 or 4 months. And then my father sent me this article in the Wall Street Journal about this doctor in Mexico who's leading a citizen uprising in the state of Michoacan, Dr. Morelas, who'd formed a group of a self-defense group called the Autodefensas. He didn't send it to me thinking I'd go down there. He just sent it to me, wow, this is intellectually interesting or similar to what you're doing. Basically, you know, the next day I figured out how to get in touch with him. I reached out to a journalist in Mexico. And I think it was literally within 2 weeks I was down in Mexico filming, and the film just completely changed.
Well, what made you think that you wanted to do that if you were all involved with the vigilantes and that story? What made you want to just suddenly jump over into Mexico and follow his story?
You know,
I mean, it was a good move, but
I think early on, I just felt like I could tell this. I felt like I wanted to tell this parallel story on both sides of the border. And it was,
on both sides, yeah.
It was so clear that although they were doing completely separate things, you know, I could create this parallel narrative. I had no idea where this was all going to go. I felt like I needed to go down and see what was happening, because obviously the tragedy of Mexico is really the everyday citizens that are caught in the crossfire of this, you know, never ending drug war. And so in that sense, I think I just pulled down there to try to humanize and put a human face again to that suffering and to what was happening. And I felt like when I first got to Mexico, I was really telling this story about these freedom fighters, rising up to fight against the evil drug cartels. And it was a sort of like black and white story of good versus evil. Right. And very, very, very quickly, I started to realize that it was much more complicated. And, where were these guns coming from? Where were these trucks coming from? Where was this money coming from? And the lines between good and evil became ever more blurry. And, it just,
I never quite understood that, because, where was the money coming from for the doctor? Where was he getting the money for the trucks and the guns and everything else? So they were becoming the same as the drug lords.
At one point, when they were raiding the houses of the cartel people, they were taking things and money, and they said, well, that's the same thing they do to us.
Right.
So to me, that was part of the money.
I think that, there was a benevolent side of it for sure. There was a pure side of the movement, and that, was wealthy businessmen and women who were donating to the cause, who obviously would benefit from getting rid of the cartels and the taxes they're imposing on the citizens. But, I think as time went on, people started to usurp the movement and realize that they could, essentially form another cartel. And that's really what the film became was the formation of another cartel. And so, some of the money was coming from other cartels, rival cartels, meth labs that they took over that they were then funding the movement with. But in the beginning, I had no idea that was all happening. I started to discover that with time.
Did it become more and more frightening when you realized that?
100%. It definitely got more and more scary as time went on, just because I didn't know who was who. By the end, the lines between the cartel, the autodefensas, and the government were so blurry. It's hard to tell where the allegiances were and who was who. And there's one moment in the film where I was with Dr. Morales as he was being hunted by his own men, as he was being hunted by the government, as he was being hunted by the cartel, and thought he was going to die. And then 12 hours later, I was filming with the people who were hunting him. So it was so complicated from a sort of producing point of view, because I was not playing both sides, but really filming multiple perspectives of what was happening. And that was really scary, just because I didn't know, obviously, if someone found out exactly what was happening, they, might not have been too happy with what I was doing.
And were they concerned about how you were presenting them? Did they want to be presented a certain way and push you to present them in the way that they wanted to?
I think the stakes were so high that, and there's definitely a sort of, these guys had egos, and I think they enjoyed their moment in front of the camera. But the stakes were also very high every day. There's a lot of other things they were worrying about besides me. And so, and I think I really try to approach my subjects, and I said this to everyone I filmed with, and I think this is what allowed me to get these multiple perspectives, is that I have no agenda. I'm not trying to muckrake here. I'm not trying to expose anyone. I'm just trying to tell the story of what's happening. Let me do that. Please let me do that. And that, trust isn't just earned and given overnight. It's something you build over weeks and months. And so I think the fact that I didn't just, like a lot of people, helicopter in and out for 12 days or 2 days or 24 hours, like a lot of journalists were doing, that I was there for 9 months. I was there for almost half of every month for 9-10 months. And so I developed really deep relationships with people on all different sides of the spectrum. That were legitimate relationships, and so I think that's what really allowed me to, they saw that I cared. They saw that I wanted to tell the story. That's when the doors started to open up. That's also as it got scarier.
How did you choose when to stop?
That must always be a hard point, to know when to stop.
It's sort of interesting to have the end of the film, the shot of Dr. Morales in jail. That whole circle closing in. It must be hard to know when to stop.
I think that's sort of the age old question in documentaries is when to stop. Sometimes it's when you run out of money. Sometimes it's really clear.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. I've never made a doc like Cartel Land. Like every single day, it was such rich material. Like you could sort of choose your own adventure, and so I could have kept filming for months, and I'm sure I discovered really interesting stuff. But I think it was, when I found out that those the meth cooks were also the auto defensas while wearing the government shirt, and just everything came full circle. That's when I was like, okay, well, clearly I have an arc here. And that also sort of dovetailed with when the doctor was arrested. And so obviously his arc came to some sort of, completion. And so that's really when I decided to stop.
And what did the vigilantes that you were originally starting with think of the movie in the end, since it really had a lot about the people that they were trying to keep out of the country? I suppose in a way that would be a good thing, though.
And that Naylor was such a strong character, and obviously wanted to say his piece to you, to the camera, to get it out. I mean, so personally, I think he's demented, but I mean, what did he think of the final product?
I think he actually, had a lot of admiration for the doctor. And for what they were doing. I think, I don't agree with a lot of the things that they do, obviously, and what they stand for. But I think to some degree he felt a kinship with his mission.
Naylor seemed to want to give his agenda, want to explain himself and what he was doing, and was quite proud of who he was. Did he feel he'd come across well in your film?
Yeah, I was definitely nervous. I always show my subjects the film before the film goes out into the world, and the film premiered at Sundance, and I showed him the film in person, and definitely nervous doing that. But I think he really responded to it, and he actually ended up coming to Sundance. I would have loved to have the doctor come as well, but he was still imprisoned. And in a sad twist, he actually died of COVID.
Oh, wow.
A couple of years ago, as I was making my COVID documentary, The First Wave.
Oh my gosh.
Ironic.
So,
yeah. Can we just talk about how you went about that? Was it just you with a single camera? I mean, how many people were involved in the filming, and how did you know when to go back and forth into, say, Mexico or to Arizona and the border?
What ended up becoming the film was obviously the vast majority of the footage ended up being in Mexico. And we spent, way more time there than we did in Arizona. I had a really small team with me. There's a friend of mine, Matt Porwall, who shot with me. My producer, Miles Esty, who I'd met very early on, helped connect me with the doctor in Mexico. He's a Canadian journalist living in Mexico. And then we had an amazing local fixer named Daniel Fernandez, who was integral in helping, me infiltrate that world. But oftentimes it was just me alone filming. Sometimes it was the four of us. It depended on the day, but it was, really, really small team. And, all of us developed those relationships with the auto defensists down there.
And is everything that's in the film happening for real and you don't know about? Or, I mean, some of the shootouts, are any of them rehearsals or practices that the auto de fe are doing? That's actually as it's happening and you're there.
I would have loved to have some other takes and during the shootouts, but no, that is all real time.
Yeah.
This shows how sort of dark and twisted my brain got, but I remember that sort of main shootout in the film when they captured Chineca and Caballo, the two men who murdered that woman's husband and kidnapped her. During that the night of that shootout, I remember looking at the footage and just being so upset that the sound was a bit overmodulated, the gunshots, and I thought I ruined that scene and we could never use it, and just being so upset with myself. So I would have loved another take if I could have.
So how were you shooting and recording sound then? What camera did you have, and
That's what we were doing. We were totally one-man banding, taking our own sound. We had a shotgun on top of the camera,
right.
often just one lav on one of our main subjects, and taking sound ourselves. Occasionally, Miles would have a boom, but definitely not in situations like that. When it was absolutely run and gun, high stakes.
Right. And were you always shooting together in the same scene, or did sometimes you split apart and shoot different aspects?
Sometimes we separated, but that scene, I was just alone by myself, shooting.
Right.
But yeah, sometimes we shot different things. Some of the bigger crowd moments, we shot 2 cameras at the same time, but it just depended on the situation.
And what was the camera that you used?
We used a Canon C300 and pretty much just 2 lenses the whole time, 17 to 55 and a 24 to 105. I actually always remember in that specific shootout too. Started out on the wide, and I just realized, I feel like I wasn't feeling the intimacy, and so just in the middle of this madness, sort of shakily trying to change lenses to the 24 to 105. But I think I actually found a lot of comfort. It sounds crazy, but in shooting during those times, and being behind the camera and focusing on aperture and focusing on focusing and framing, and that actually helped, calm me down in very stressful situations.
There's a very famous, and I don't remember the cameraman who was involved, but there was a famous footage of a basically cameraman shooting in a war zone, and he's basically shooting his own death because he's so distracted by what he's filming. He doesn't see the guy in the middle of he does see the guy in the middle of his frame, point a gun at him and shoot him. And it's somehow there's something very distracting. I mean, I haven't done nearly as much as you, but when I was first starting, I was doing a bit, and I felt carrying a camera in a difficult situation kind of protected you, or you felt you were protected in a way which is kind of a bit unreal.
No, I think a lot of war correspondents or war photographers feel that way. It's the camera is their protection.
I think there's a big shift now. I mean, you talked about the Mazel brothers and Fred Wiseman's way of shooting and that, but like Fred Wiseman would always be shooting with a cameraman. He was very much directing, and it'd be either Bill Brame, who worked with him for many years, did some of probably his most famous films. Fred Wiseman was very much the director, and there was a cameraman, but that was when it was film and you had 400-foot magazines and all the rest, and it was quite a palaver. It's changed enormously the way you could shoot. We were talking to the great Romanian documentary filmmaker Alexander Nanau a while ago. And the fact that he could just sort of sit in this minister's office with his camera and be in the corner and just sort of dissolve into the background and not have to, carry big magazines and changing bags and reels of, 16mm film and stuff. I mean, it's quite a shift in what you can do, isn't it? Because of the technology.
100%. I mean, there's no way I'd have a career or I'd be able to make the films that I'm able to make. Shooting on film, at least I don't think I would be able to. I think Cartelland, we shot around 1,000 hours of footage. First wave was probably, somewhere between around 1,500 hours. My new Afghanistan film is around that too. So you just obviously can't shoot that on film, and having to change mags every 12 minutes or however long it takes. It just. Right now, the camera that I'm shooting on, I can roll for 3 hours straight.
Wow.
And often I do, with one battery and 2 cards, I just roll for 3 hours. And to me, that's when I'm at my happiest, when I'm just sort of alone rolling and waiting for those moments, because you just never know when the moments are going to happen. Yeah, right. And it's all about the patience of waiting for them.
Yeah. Film magazine, the moment would happen and you would turn on and you would always getting it late, and that's why sometimes you develop a sixth sense and kind of, get a sense of when something was going to happen, but you were still really playing catch up a lot of the time.
And what about your linking shots, like the drone shots, the other shots that get you from one thing to another? Do you do that later when you sort of know what you need, or are you trying to grab it as you go as well?
I think both. I get very stir crazy when I'm shooting, or said differently, when I'm not shooting. So if there's, if we're waiting for a subject, if you, often, they'd say meet at 9 and it wouldn't be till 1 p.m. that we meet up or whatever in the case of Cartel Land. And so I just, we'd spend those hours getting atmospherics, especially in Cartel Land, I guess in the first wave as well, but especially in Cartel Land, the setting was a character. The Cartel Land, the visuals of that place, because that's what they were fighting for. They're fighting for, the lime groves. They're fighting for the avocados. They're fighting for that's what made it, as well as the meth and the drugs. But it was, it was a very rich landscape, both visually and literally. And so, making that a character was really important. And, but yes, and at certain times we would go back and sort of get shots that I felt we needed, but we definitely were sort of cataloging visuals as we went.
I mean, there's a drone shot of the border wall, Arizona border wall, which is very striking. I mean, did you carry a drone and do those things as you were there, or was that something you picked up? That
is something that I brought in a drone op to do that with me, but we did shoot some of our own drones at that point. Nowadays, we're basically shooting drones ourselves all the time. I don't use drone operators or big drones, because the small little sort of $800, $1,000 drones look as good, I think. So we often carry them with us as we're shooting, if there's a moment to capture them. But I think, drones are getting more and more overused in docs, especially. And to me, it's always important to have a motivation for getting up in the air, as opposed to just for style points or for stylistic reasons.
Yeah.
And how do you keep track of all the footage as you're shooting? So I did get that. How do you go to your room at night and write down everything you shot?
Or do you edit as you go along in any way? Or
it depends on the film. I mean, when I'm shooting, I always go and watch the footage at night, even if it means getting no sleep, because I really like to know what I have. So even, at this point in my career, I still love downloading my own footage and watching it at night, just because you have to know what you're getting. And also, if the mic plays correctly, is, just if you're sort of shooting on your own, you got to know if what you're getting is working. And so, and I've tried to start editing simultaneous to shooting more and more as my career has progressed, just because it's more efficient.
So the first wave, you had multiple teams, I believe, didn't you, to cover that film? So how different was that, operating that way?
And viewing stuff at night, because there must have been a lot more stuff to view.
And why that decision to do it that way? Because, I mean, we've talked to you before, and for us, I think it's fair to say the strongest stuff is where you are following particular characters, which is obviously what Cartel Land was, but in the same in First Wave, you follow a couple of patients and there's a couple of nurses that really become fundamental to your connection with the story, So tell us your thinking about how you approach that.
I mean, I woke up in early March 2020, like everybody else did, and was terrified by this tsunami that was about to sweep across our world and our country. And I just felt this enormous obligation to try to document it. And so I reached out to hospital systems all across the country to try to get access, and got pretty much rejected from everyone. And then finally got access to a hospital system in New York, I live in New York City, and ended up being quite fortuitous, as New York became the epicenter during that first wave. And, I think early on, the goal was just to try to document this sort of historic virus. And I wanted to try to put a human face to it. I had no idea where this was going to go, what was going to happen. We were so naive that's sort of why we started out shooting with multiple teams, to be honest, because we thought it was just going to be, 2, 3, 4 weeks and it'll be over. And we really wanted to try to capture this, as intimately and deeply as possible. Obviously, we ended up filming for 4 months during the whole first wave. And here we are, 2+ years later, and in a whatever fifth wave or sixth, whatever wave we are on now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I always knew, I knew that I wanted to follow patients and doctors in a really intimate way. I didn't know who those would be, and I think that's the sort of dirty little secret that people don't like talking about in docs is I think casting in documentaries is as or more important than casting in narrative films because, they are your conduits to the story. And, in the case of the first wave, I struck gold with Dr. Duget, our main doctor that we followed, who I met, I think 2 or 3 days into filming, who ended up becoming this incredible spokeswoman for this experience and really let me film her and, at the hardest moments of her life, both in the hospital and then as the film morphed into also a story about, the racial unrest that we were seeing in our country following the killing of George Floyd. And as she, took off her doctor's uniform and went out in the streets and started to protest, she just became a very dynamic and interesting character that we followed over these months.
So were you primarily following her, or how did you work with multiple crews?
It was really hard because, we were filming often 2 or 3 things at once with multiple characters. And so I shot far less on the first wave than most films I've made, just because I was overseeing so many different things at a given time. And so, that was also hard just because I was working with a couple of DPs that I hadn't worked with before and sort of creating a visual language that still felt like mine, that still felt, of the vein of everything else I'd done, but also, trying to find the cinema in really cramped, poorly lit environments, especially inside the hospital, was really difficult. And so we had many, 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 many conversations and learned as we went to try to, just try to find the cinema in these,
That's interesting. What would you do differently if you were back there again?
Build a hospital with bigger rooms, light them.
No. I mean, realistically, how would you have approached it any differently? Would you have done it just by yourself, or would you change the perspective of the film in any way? Just interesting.
I don't know. I'm really hard on myself, and I think that's, as I'm sure we all are, and I'm never really satisfied with anything that I do. But I'm not. It's hard to say what I would do differently. Because it's, I don't.
You'll never be in that position again.
I don't love second guessing things either. So I always follow my instincts, for better, for worse. And I'm not sure what I'd do differently.
And that's another one to ask. How did you know when to stop filming? Because nothing really ended.
Still be there, wouldn't you? Really.
There was a real arc to the first wave, especially in New York, and visually too, that's another example where the city of New York really was a character, as much as any of our other characters. And, March was really terrifying. We knew nothing. So many people were dying. April, similarly, then the spring happened in May, and the trees blossomed and the world opened up a bit and the cases started to become less and less. And so there's just a real arc. And then obviously, most importantly, with our main subjects, a New York City cop, Ahmed Ellis, that we followed, who was ventilated for many, many weeks. Him getting out of the hospital, there's just a natural arc over these 4 months that was so vivid and clear. So we knew, basically in June that we had a film and sort of started editing.
Was there anybody you followed that you filmed that withdrew their permission after they'd seen the film or later on?
No, not really.
I only ask because I remember doing a film on mental hospital, following some patients through their treatment in the mental hospital, and always regretted one of the patients said, or one of the doctor said, you can't use this one patient's You can't use the footage you shot of this one patient, and we'd followed her over about 3 months, and it was so telling. Well, I mean, we had other patients in the film, but this one character it was so telling of the whole system. But sometimes that's where you are.
Why did they say that you can use it?
The doctor thought that it would affect this person too much if the film was out there and them seeing themselves, and it was the doctor's opinion was we shouldn't use that person, and we'd been filming in this hospital because of that particular doctor and his permission for the whole film. So that was it really. But yeah, anyway, that was by and by. So why then did you recently? We want to go back to talk about A Private War, but maybe we should talk about Retrograde, your last film in Afghanistan. So why you go from like COVID, a war, to a real war?
I think you're just a thrill seeker. What is it? That you like being in a point of danger.
To be honest, that actually couldn't be farther from the truth. Although most people looking at my work would probably say that. I'm terrified in these situations, and especially with the first wave. In a situation like Cartel Land or Retrograde, my new Afghanistan film, you go to these places. It's extremely high intensity, extremely dangerous, and you can come home and somewhat turn your brain off and detach. Whereas in the first wave, we were living the same thing that we were documenting. You could never really turn your brain off, and if you remember those first couple of months, it was terrifying for everyone. So just being at home and cooking food and opening the door and getting into a car. I mean, all these things were vectors to get the virus. And so it just was a sort of full on 24/7 experience for many months. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's never about the fear or the danger for me. It's about what I said earlier, about trying to take these big amorphous things and trying to humanize them. And that's I think the through line. And at 39 years old, I think I'm getting a bit burned out of doing this, and I'm definitely contemplating not a career shift necessarily, but sort of really thinking about my choices more than I have been, because I've just worked without any real sense or care of my own well-being, and I've nightmares every night. I've suffer a bit from PTSD and stuff. So these are real things, and I'd like to try to change up the pace of it, I think.
Have you seen the great war photographer Don McCullen? You've seen his photographs of Yorkshire. He's like such a shift, He went from one world to another, and it's quite telling, really.
I've always fantasized about. It's funny you say that. I've always fantasized about like shooting like Planet Earth or a big nature show or something.
Yeah.
Or maybe just going back to narrative films.
Well, yeah. What drew you to your first narrative film? I think Private War. Another war.
Well, it seems like another person covering dangerous things. So, is this a reflection of yourself?
Yes, right. You're looking in the mirror.
It's interesting you say that. In some interesting way, I think A Private War is probably my most personal film. Marie Colvin, who the film is about, a war correspondent who was killed in Syria, really struggled with whether her work in covering these conflict zones actually made a difference. And this is something that she was tortured by, and it's something that I definitely struggle with. Do these films actually make a difference? Does anyone care?
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem, isn't it? Because how do people watch them as well? With the saturation of media and action movies, I mean, how are they watching now a documentary set in Afghanistan or wherever compared with a Marvel comic movie? I'm not sure.
It's harder to find documentaries, yeah.
It's harder to find, but what's their reaction to it?
Well, because it's making them think, and sometimes that's not a good thing. You just want to...
Or are they just watching it as another piece of action?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Does it really... What do you think, Matt? We're asking you, not me.
Well, no, I mean, I don't know. And how do you measure impact, and what is impact? And are you, these are all sort of unanswerable questions.
What would the world be like if there hadn't been Fred Wiseman, the Maisels, and people like yourself making documentaries and saying things about the way the world is. If they hadn't existed, maybe we'd be in worse trouble now. So you can't quantify it, can you? That's the problem.
For sure. And I think, in the case of the first wave, I think one of the saddest things about COVID is how politicized it's, made our country and our world. In an alternate universe, COVID could have brought us all together. You look throughout history, wars and conflicts often bring societies together. And instead, it just further divided us. And in my humble opinion, I think one of the reasons for that is that we weren't seeing the tragedy of what was happening inside hospitals in those early weeks and early months. Journalists weren't allowed inside. We were extremely fortunate to be able to film in there, and not a lot of people were able to, especially sort of daily or weekly news sources, and which we weren't, obviously. Our film didn't come out for another year or so. And so I think not seeing those images of how people were living or dying of COVID really contributed to this sort of hyper politicization of the issue, because I think that could have allowed people to have something to come together to talk about or think about or reflect on. And so that's a big reason why I felt like I wanted to make that film. And there's a huge debate going on right now in journalism about gun violence. Should we see the images of the children in Texas? Would that change? I mean, it's horrific to even say that out loud and to think about it, but would that change the debate?
I don't know. You go back to that, again, Don McCullen's photograph from Vietnam, I think it was, where the dead bodies on the street, and it was a full double page center of the Times, this color photograph. And that was the first time people saw death in their Sunday paper as they were, eating their toast or whatever, having breakfast. And there was kind of an outcry. But now that sort of image now is just, that's everywhere, isn't it? Does it make a difference now? How more can we be shocked?
But at the same time, do people really respond to, for instance, gun control if they don't viscerally know what damage it does?
What the effect is.
If their sister's child got killed, then they understand. But can we make them understand by showing them? And it's so important that they understand.
And that's why I at least try to make the films the way that I do, because I just, to me, the only way to care about an issue is by really personalizing it to an individual, to Dr. Morales, to Dr. Dujay in the first wave, to General Sadat in my new Afghanistan film is hopefully by highlighting an individual, you actually, can empathize or care with, in that issue, about that issue in a way that you might not otherwise through stats or, infographics or whatever other ways people take in information.
So that probably is why you went to a private war and making a film very personally about one journalist trying to do what you do.
I think so, yeah. And I think I also artistically wanted to just continue to challenge myself. Obviously, in your career, you've made such a wide range of incredible films. But I assume part of what excites you in approaching new films is sort of, what is the new challenge with it? How can I say something different? And certainly with a private war, I just wanted to continue to expand myself as an artist. And, I was extremely humbled that people thought I, might be able to make a narrative film. And it was an incredible experience.
And what was the biggest challenge for you? What was the biggest challenge or the biggest surprise?
I mean, obviously, it's just so different than making docs, where I'm, most comfortable being alone in the middle of nowhere. And suddenly in the private war, there's
you got 1 million people,
300 to 400 people sitting around, staring at me. And I'm like, I don't know, I've never done this before. But I owe a ton to Bob Richardson, who I learned, a lot from in shooting that film. I think the hardest thing for me, honestly, was when you're in the middle of nowhere making a doc, you're not thinking about money. You're thinking about how to tell a story.
Yeah.
In narrative filmmaking, and I know it's the same whether you're making a $5,000 film or a $50 million film, but this sort of intersection between art and commerce was really hard for me to deal with. Matt, if you want to change angles, that's gonna, you're on a clock. You're gonna miss your day. Like just the constant reminder of money and economics and calendar and timing just was hard for me to wrap my head around. I know it's an issue that everyone deals with, but it's just, that was really foreign to me from docs, where I have the luxury of time. And, you know, if I go over an hour, it's no one cares. I'm just, you know, it's another taco, you know, and a drink. Like, you know, there's no real ramifications.
Yeah. And how was it working with actors?
I loved it. You know, I really loved it. And that's why, you know, I'm so excited to keep doing it. I found what I learned in documentaries of gaining trust and gaining the rapport of my subjects very similar to working with actors is that to me, it's all about, you know, trust and respect and that ability to communicate a vision and work together to, you know, fulfill that vision, obviously with actors, but also with the rest of your team. So that, you know, that was really fun. And I felt like that was really transferable from my experience in documentaries. And I really tried in A Private War to make it as sort of raw and visceral as any of my docs were. And that's the sort of aesthetic through which we approached it.
But was it kind of fun to be able to repeat things? Because you can't in a documentary. Say, I wish that you had been closer to that chair. Oh, we could do that.
Yeah. How many takes did you do? Yeah.
It did feel like I was like cheating the system or something. I was like, I can do 2 takes on this. I can do 5 takes. I can do 15 takes. It was a wonderful experience. And, you know, working with Rosamund Pike and Jamie Dornan and Stanley Tucci, and just, it was, you know, they're all, I think, I'm just really humbled, having never done it before, to have, you know, incredibly talented group of people around me that I learned so much from.
But then also, when you're doing a documentary, you have to keep track of what the story is, because the story keeps changing as you learn more and all of that. But when you're doing a narrative, you're kind of within that story. So is that a difference too? Because I would think it would be kind of exciting to be on a documentary and go, oh, that's what where we're going. But in a narrative, you kind of need to stick to the story because the choices you might make on set might not be the right ones for the script.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of cliche thing that people say is that, like, you know, docs are made in the edit room and you know, narrative films are made in the script.
Oh, that's not true.
Which I don't think is remotely true at all. You know, but, you know, a lot of people say that. I just think it couldn't be farther from the truth. Yeah, I think bringing that ethos that Al Maisel said when I was 21 to the narrative process was really fun. Be open to the story changing. Be open to the wonderful accidents of life, which were all around us on set. And sort of trying to create an environment on set where people felt free to improvise and be themselves. And you know, Roz brought so much to that role of Marie Colvin. And we spent months and months and months and months researching Marie with her friends and her colleagues in that world. And, you know, it was also interesting, especially shooting all the war zones in Jordan. Almost all the characters around Roz and Jamie were non-actors, were everyday people from those regions. So when we're in home Syria, I spent weeks and weeks and weeks interviewing and finding people who are actually from Homs. And, you know, the man who's, you know, crying after his young boy dies on the table after bombardment in Homs. You know, that guy really was from Syria. His nephew was shot by a sniper from Assad's army. So those tears were real tears. And so creating an environment on set where the emotion was actually quite real. And I think that was actually really hard for Rosamund because it was so intense. The environment on set was so real. And I don't think she had been ever experienced anything like that on set where she just was overcome. And at one point she ran off set and said, I can't handle this. This is just too much. And so I think that friction and that tension and that emotion, I think, hopefully brought a lot to the film and the goal of at least trying to make it feel somewhat authentic.
But it's still based on a true story, so you have to hit certain story points. Otherwise, you're not telling the story. So that must have been a little tough at times because you knew you had to stick to it. For sure. Sticking to the script, but also leaving room for improvisation, but also in the edit room too. Like the film changed a lot in the edit, which I was, you know, pleasantly surprised by. And I think we found, you know, a visual language that I saw when we were shooting, but that I wasn't sure we'd be able to achieve.
and sort of getting inside of her head, inside of Marie's head. And PTSD and alcoholism and addiction are hard things to depict on camera, are hard things to act, are hard things to direct. So finding that, I think we really found that language in the edit room.
Would you ever think about doing a kind of a Rossellini, a sort of Rome open city, and setting a fictional story within a real world? I'm not suggesting the war. Like Rossellini used the end of the Second World War in Italy to film as a backdrop. But I mean, would you ever consider blending more? In the way you were saying that you cast a lot of characters that are actually those characters. But would you do that in terms of setting action within a situation, maybe?
I've thought about it a lot, and something I would love to do. I think it would have to be motivated, in the right setting, the right environment, but it's definitely something I've pondered.
Yeah, sometimes I feel, feature filmmaking is so, it's so split off from the real world, and we try and create the real world and we don't use enough of it. That's why I really love shooting on location, but I mean, you could go further than that, really. But I never have, and not many people have since Rossellini, really. But
should we do something together? Where do you want to
go? Sounds like fun.
Where do you want to go?
I don't know, but not Ukraine, but anyway.
Well, it doesn't have to be a war zone. We could find somewhere else.
No, please not that.
Better.
But no, more like your geographic thing, the blue planet or something, but set sort of a... I don't know what, but I just love shooting on location. Don't you find, another thing Fred Wiseman said was that his films are elaborations of a personal experience and not ideologically objective portraits of his subjects. And that goes back to us talking about you're always subjective in some way. You're always selecting what you see and what you shoot and when you're there. It is for me, I've got to say, my documentary experience, again, nothing like yours, but it was my way of seeing the world. And as much as I was into the filmmaking and the subjects, it was also my experience. It was my life. And I find that has been all the way through shooting features as well. I like the experience of a location, whether it's, shooting in Morocco on Kundun or something. How important is that to you, your experience of the world, regardless of what you come back with in the film and how that's received?
It's extremely important. I think especially the films that I've made, they're difficult experience, journeys. And if you're not either terrified or moved or touched in some way by the people that you're with, then why are you doing it? If it's not changing you, if you're not growing as a human being, and I can look at every single one of my films, and each of them have pushed me and challenged me in my view of the world and who I am as a person and how I apply that to my real life. And I think that's part of why I feel so lucky to do what I do, to every year or two to dive into another world and to explore it, and to try to learn from those experiences. And I think this is somewhat tangential to what you said, but I think one thing I really try to do is make my films as apolitical as possible, and I think I try to take things that are so polarizing and try to generate conversation, because that to me is the point of film, is to get people to think, to ponder, to question themselves, question the world that's around them, and to... Yeah, and so it's been interesting most recently, and when we get off this podcast, I'm going to go back to the edit room, trying to finish this film. But I've been making this film about Afghanistan, and it's been interesting screening it for people on the far right and the far left, and just seeing how different people react. I love doing that. I love seeing how people from completely different walks of life can relate to film if you present it in a certain way. And I think in the climate that we're living in, with, turning on the news every night, which I can barely watch these days, it's so polarizing and so bifurcating.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deacons. See you next time.